After coaching thousands of surfing students over the past 5 years, I've picked up some pervasive, common mistakes that everyone seems to be struggling with. In today's episode, I'm going to give you 5 big impact tips to correct these common mistakes using some examples from my wave pool surf retreats. If you want to progress from beginner to intermediate as fast as possible, then this video is for you. What's up guys, my name is Kale Brock. I'm a filmmaker and a surfer and a surf coach, and today I want to share with you some big impact tips for beginner surfing progression. This episode is brought to you by the Beginner Surfer's Roadmap. It's my new online course designed to take you from a beginner surfer all the way through to intermediate. Check it out at the link in the description below or head to thesurfersroadmap.com. Let's jump in. The first thing that I want to look at here is the fundamental principle of surfing, which is where you look is where you go. Now, these concrete examples are going to give you an idea of how just some minor suboptimal technique applications with regards to that can really limit a surfer. So you can see here how the surfer is actually looking down the whole time whilst on a wave. If we sort of drag this back to the start here and you watch overall what happens on the wave, you can see the eyes very rarely leave down here in this lower part of the wave. If we sort of consider the idea that where you look is where you go, then this surfer is only going to end up here in this sort of what we call the dead zone or the flats of the wave. This up here, this upper sort of half of the wave is what we call the power zone. That's where a lot of the energy is, and that's the zone we want to get to, at least temporarily throughout our ride, so that we can maximize, aesthetic performance, but also functional performance. That section, that top half of the wave, that's where we're going to get speed from, and that's where we're going to do our maneuvers. So that's where we want to look. One thing that I like to do to more visually demonstrate this, if I was to sort of play this surfer's ride here and put an arrow across the halfway point of the wave, then you would probably find that the surfer doesn't actually cross it at all during the ride. And that's a sign for me that they're either not aware of where they're looking or that they don't have the shoulder rotation to get themselves up into that section as well, which is actually our second tip for today. Point where you want to go. So you want to look and you want to point where you want to go on a wave. Now, literally, that might make you feel a little bit silly. You know, no one travels along the wave going like that, okay? But what it will do is it will anchor your shoulders into an appropriate movement for the direction of travel that you want to go in. So if we actually watch this wave here, see the surfer's leading arm. You can see his left arm ends up pointing sort of in contradiction to where he's actually wanting to go on the wave. So his eyeline is actually very good. Now subsequently that should actually cause the shoulders to sort of come into alignment as well, but for whatever reason there's a little technique hiccup here that's sort of limiting him. So you can imagine in this instance here, the surfer's trying to travel up this way into the power zone, presumably to do a maneuver, but you can see with the shoulders they're actually rotating back this way at this time. Now it's the leading arm that's most important. It's the leading arm that we want to point to where we want to go on the wave. You can see the surfer's leading arm here has actually become the trailing arm for this moment, and thus actually working in reverse, the opposite to where he wants to go. So a great effective tip if you want to actually start to be more in control of your surfing and where you go on a wave is to not only look but also point as well. The third thing I want to talk about is compression, particularly in the lower body. One thing I see a lot with beginner to intermediate surfers even is this sort of lack of awareness in how to compress into the legs. What ends up happening with a lot of surfers is they end up with quite straight legs, as you can see in this example here, compared to over to the left side of screen. You've got me quite sort of almost like sitting in a chair in that position. Over here, what tends to happen is we tend to get this hinge at the hips instead of a bend in the knees. And what that does, it's a much weaker position to surf from. If I was to say to you, can you please put 100 kilos on your shoulders and actually jump with it or move directions with it, you wouldn't hinge at the hips and sort of try and deadlift that weight. You would bend at the knees into a really strong squat position, a loaded position, a coiled spring position. These are all the same sort of things that we're talking about with that terminology, because that's the most powerful position to be in to then unload and express that energy in a maneuver, or in this case, a bottom turn. So what we see overall is this sort of jagged looking surfing that doesn't have a lot of spring or energy. And that's when it's really important to start getting used to sinking into compression in the lower body. So our cue there when we work with surfers at the wave pool and in my online program is to think about when you're at the bottom of the wave, being nice and low and loaded into that coiled spring position, and then actually jumping up to the top of the wave, really thinking about and going through that typical jumping movement to release that energy to then get up to the top of the wave. That there is one of the most key movements in order to open up that big sort of Pandora's box of maneuvers in surfing, which is one thing that a lot of beginners want to do. Fourth mistake that I want to talk about is the paddle. Paddling and entering a wave is of critical importance in everyone surfing, regardless of if you're a beginner, intermediate, advanced, or even a pro. And a lot of advanced surfers know this, and you can see big differences in how people paddle, to the point where I can actually quite successfully predict how good someone is going to surf just based on how they paddle and how they enter a wave, which is very interesting. You can see in a couple of these examples here how, due to a lack of drive with the paddle, the surfer ends up getting hung up at the top of the wave and thus doesn't get a nice clean entry into the wave. So what that means is, when I say clean entry, is we actually want the fins to be engaged with the clean face of the wave so that we can actually have a nice amount of grip on the surface, so that we don't slide out, we don't sort of get ruffled and tumbled around in the whitewater. The whitewater is a very slippery place to be, so we want to kind of avoid that area with our surfing, in particular with the takeoff. So if you watch the surfer here, you can see that because of his too frantic paddling, he hasn't found enough momentum to match the wave's momentum. And you can see at this last point here is actually moving back up the wave into a higher part of the wave as he's paddling for it, which for me is a telltale sign that he's not paddling strong enough or with enough forward momentum to match the wave's pitch in order to get out in front of that lip. Now what we see happen is he's taken off and he's in quite a not too bad a position physically, but where he is on the wave is quite challenging. You can see the board is actually trapped in that whitewater there, and thus he's going to have a hard time riding down the face of the wave nice and cleanly in order to get out and get back up into that power zone. This is a very common occurrence for a lot of surfers in the ocean, in the wave pool. Paddling is of the essence. There are some really good tutorials on my channel that you can check out, and we've also got a really comprehensive and effective training program in the new online course on the Surfer's Roadmap, which you guys should check out. And you can see here, even on the backhand as well, once the surfer gets sort of pulled back and stuck up in that whitewater zone, it's very hard for them to actually escape it and get out into that clean face with a lot of success. Number 5, in order to expect progression in surfing, it's something you have to do regularly. And I know that sounds incredibly obvious, but you'd be surprised at how many people I see who are really frustrated with their stagnated progress. And then they tell me that they only surf once every 2 weeks, or once a week, or once a month, mind you. This is a really big problem. If you wanted to get better at speaking French, you'd do it more than once a week, wouldn't you? If you wanted to get better at lawn bowls, you would practice more than once a week. Because surfing is such a intensive sort of activity, it requires so much attention, it requires so much commitment, people tend to attribute and give a lot of weight to those individual sessions. But it's actually the frequency of your surfing that has a major impact on how fast you progress. If you think about just learning how to read waves in the ocean, you know, if you are only surfing once a week, once a fortnight, or once a month, you're pretty much going to be plateauing for the rest of your life with your surfing career after that initial jump up the learning curve. So that's something you really want to actually step up in order to guarantee progression in your surfing. Even if the surf isn't amazing, you'll still pick up things. Joel Parkinson is very famous for saying there's always one wave that makes a session, and it's absolutely true. How are you supposed to get your 10,000 hours up in order to become an expert at anything if you're only doing it once a week? So that's a very easy prescription for you guys to drastically improve your surfing. If you can surf twice a week at least, even more, you can definitely expect much more progression with your surfing. Anyway guys, that was my 5 big impact tips to guarantee fast track surfing progression. Remember to join me on Instagram at Kale's Broccoli, subscribe here on the channel, let me know in the comments what else you're struggling with your surfing, and be sure to check out thesurfersroadmap.com where we've got the brand new online course for beginner surfers. It's the best one on the market. I'm very comfortable with sharing that because it's the result of working with thousands of surfers now and working out the common problems that they experience. I'm glad to say that we've learned how to minimize those, even eliminate those, to really fast track everyone's progression. So it's super exciting. Thanks so much for watching. I'll see you guys soon.